accompanied Hijikata to Sendai. Concerned about Saito, Hijikata left Shimada with him in Aizu. Perhaps the two of them would be able to overcome dangers that Saito would have been unable to alone. Leaving Saito and Shimada turned out to be much more difficult than I had imagined. I spent so much time with them. All I could do was pray that they would survive and that we would meet again some day. As September began, the cold autumn wind blew down on the main body of the Shinsengumi as they arrived in Sendai. The trip had been easy enough, but upon our arrival we encountered a new problem. Sanan and the Fury Corps were nowhere to be found. Heisuke too was incommunicado. From the villagers in Sendai, we heard disturbing rumours that murder had been on the rise in recent days. We scarcely wanted to think about it, but it hardly seemed like it could be coincidence. Upon reaching Sendai Castle, we were greeted by a man in western garb. As soon as he laid eyes on Hijikata, his face split into a grin. "Long time no see, Hijikata." "I'm glad to see you doing well, Enomoto." The man was Takeaki Enomoto. He had been the Shogunate Navy's second-in-command. When Edo had surrendered to the imperial army without a fight, he had taken his flagship Kayomaru, captured 8 more battleships, and left. He'd taken his new fleet to Sendai and arrived before we had. "Have you already heard about Kondo?" asked Enomoto. Hijikata only nodded. "I apologize for having been unable to help. Our country has lost a truly great man." Even I could tell that Enomoto's grief was real. It was a small moment perhaps, but it was easy to see from it that Enomoto was a good man. "He would have been happy to hear you say that," said Hijikata. He gave a short, melancholy laugh, but his eyes were peaceful. But he wouldn't want us to stand around crying about him. He'd want us to get to work. Can you give me a rundown of the situation in Sendai?" Enomoto gave him a bitter smile. You're right, Hijikata. Unfortunately, the news isn't very good." I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach. "To begin with," said Enomoto, "there's something wrong at Sendai Castle. I'm not sure what they're thinking. I've requested an audience, but haven't received a response." To ignore an official request was an odd response for someone like Enomoto to receive from a domain. "There's a suspicious group of men running around Sendai. Well, there are rumours, at least." "Suspicious? How?" I asked. "Well, there have been more murders here lately, and the rumours say some of the murderers ran back here to the castle." Suspicious men running amok in Sendai, possibly murdering civilians? Sanan and the Fury Corps unreachable? It wasn't difficult to put 2 and 2 together. Hijikata and I looked at one another. There was no doubt that we were thinking the same thing. Whatever the case," said Enomoto, "if this continues, we won't be able to take action. Perhaps if we could arrest these murderers and restore peace in this area." "Enomoto," said Hijikata, "think maybe you could leave the murders to me." Enomoto opened his mouth to protest, but something in Hijikata's gaze made him change his mind, and he closed his mouth again thoughtfully. "All right, I'll leave this one to you. No more questions from me." I spoke up just as Enomoto turned to go. There was something I had to ask. "Have you heard anything about Okita?" Enomoto had been in Edo long after we'd left. "Perhaps..." But he shook his head. Okita, one of the incredible Shinsengumi captains, right? No, unfortunately, I haven't heard anything. Oh, well, thank you anyway. No, my apologies that I didn't have better news for you. I bowed politely, and he smiled and walked away. Enomoto was a kind, candid man. I had a feeling he was well liked by his men, and he seemed to get along well with Hijikata. I confess I felt rather relieved. But not entirely, however. The dark cloud above our heads had merely lightened, not lifted. Do you think Sanan is the one killing people? Hijikata's face was drawn. Can't say. You heard the same things I did. No way to know for sure. But if he is, I'll have to kill him. Hijikata. His mouth tightened into a line. He got pretty freaked out when he heard about where a Fury's power comes from. It might be he's pretty depressed right now, maybe crazy. True. It certainly seemed likely that Sanan was responsible for the murders, but I hoped with all my heart that he wasn't. If the truth turned out to be different, then I didn't doubt Hijikata would kill him without hesitation, whether he wanted to or not. Strange things are afoot in Sendai, Chizuru. We can't be careless. I'd like to know what Heisuke's up to, but our priority is figuring out what's behind these murders. Got it? I nodded. There were plenty of questions I wanted to ask him, but he had other things on his mind. It wasn't the time. The following day, Hijikata began his investigation. I tried to convince him that his body needed rest, not the stress of a murder investigation. I might as well have tried to lift a horse. That was how I found myself lounging around our rooms while Hijikata went off on rounds with the rest of the soldiers. I was so engaged when an unexpected visitor arrived. Heisuke? Perhaps it was only from being up and about during the day, but he looked especially pale. Where's Hijikata? He's off doing rounds at the castle. Heisuke was clearly upset about something, but he paused for a moment to rein himself back in. Well, can you give him a message for me? I nodded. Hijikata's been very worried about you guys. We couldn't get a hold of you. I figured as much, said Heisuke. He shook his head in apology and frustration, but he was still clearly Heisuke. There was no way he was out murdering people. Can you tell me what's going on? He nodded vigorously. Yeah, I can tell you everything that's happened since we got to Sendai. Just make sure you pass it on to Hijikata. All right. Sendai Castle isn't being cooperative. Chances are they're being pressured somehow by the Imperial Army. At least that's my guess. So we looked around a little more, and while we were doing that, we found out that Cawdor's actually in Sendai. What? My father had been forced to do research on the Furies by the rebels before war broke out, or at least that's what we'd thought. But now he was here in Sendai? Yeah, and Cawdor seems to be leading a unit of Furies in the Imperial Army. He'd grown suddenly awkward, possibly because he realized his news wasn't exactly pleasant for me. Well, we figured we couldn't just let that slide, so we started watching their Furies, seeing where they were going and stuff. And? Well, I saw Sanan meet with Cawdor. What? Heisuke explained that Sanan had told him they'd be more likely to get spotted if they moved together and had gone off on his own. Sometime after they'd split up, Heisuke had seen Sanan meeting with my father. "I don't know what Sanan's up to," said Heisuke. It was certainly possible that Sanan could learn what was really going on by speaking with my father, but if there was an entire unit of Furies under my father's command, then meeting with him under false pretenses seemed awfully dangerous. Like charging into an enemy line alone. "You mean you'd like him to talk to you if he's going to go do something dangerous?" "No, see, it wasn't just once or twice. He's been meeting with Kodo a lot, and if I bring it up, he just dodges the question. He doesn't act like he's got any plans to contact the rest of the Shinsengumi. I just didn't know what to do. I heard Hijikata was in Sendai, so I snuck away and came here." It was the middle of the day, which meant Sanan was probably still sleeping. Heisuke was clearly suffering from being out with the sun, but the opportunity had been too good to miss. "That must have been hard on you." I just let my eyes fall to the floor, not sure what else to say, when several strange men suddenly leapt into the room. "What?" Without even bothering to speak, they lunged at Heisuke, swords already out and shining. He dodged the attack easily, drawing his own sword as he moved. With a snarl, Heisuke struck out at one of the men before he had a chance to recover. "Yah!" The man staggered back, blood pouring from his arm. But even as I watched, the wound closed and the blood stopped. "Furies?" "Run, Chizuru!" shouted Heisuke, but then just as I turned, "Hold on, there's no need for that." What? The voice was familiar, very familiar. "Father?" The men who'd attacked Heisuke didn't seem to see this as a sign that they should stop, and they continued to advance on Heisuke, swords glittering. Although he was clearly their superior in regard to swordsmanship, he was outnumbered and the daylight had weakened him. He moved more slowly and his strikes weren't as sure. The men my father had brought, however, showed no indication of being similarly affected. "Aren't they wonderful?" said Kodo. "Furies no longer restrained by the cycles of day and night." If what he said was true, they had indeed been improved, but I could hardly say that I saw them as wonderful. "Father, please stop them." His eyes widened as if he'd only just remembered, and he looked over to Heisuke with a smile. "Ah, yes, I don't know how to thank you. Without you, it would have taken me much longer to find my daughter." "You followed me," said Heisuke. Heisuke spat out through gritted teeth. My father ignored him and turned back to me. His voice was soft. "I've come to get you. At last we'll be able to restore our clan." "Clan? You mean the Yukimura?" He smiled and nodded. "With these superior furies, restoring the glory of our clan will be child's play." He was talking nonsense. Or perhaps I simply didn't want to understand. "You're planning to use furies to restore the Yukimura lineage to power?" "Yes, I am. I've done all of this for you." I stood stunned for a moment, then shook my head. "I can't go with you, Father. I don't want glory if it comes from violence." I gave him a shaky smile, hoping that it might help him accept my refusal. Instead, he walked closer. I tried to back away, but there were furies blocking my way. "You've been with the Shinsengumi for too long," he said. "They've corrupted you." "What? No! I hadn't changed. He had." "God damn it, get off me, you bastards!" shouted Heisuke. He'd managed to keep the Furies at bay with his sword, but we were both completely surrounded. "Father, if we just sit down and talk this through," said Kodo, "I'm sure you'd understand." Then he drove his fist into my stomach. The stars leapt up before my eyes, the world went dim, and I slipped into unconsciousness. When I awoke, I was in a room I didn't recognize. Where am I? My words had been more for myself than anything, as I didn't expect an answer, but to my surprise, a familiar voice spoke from behind me. "You're in Sendai Castle." "Sanan?" And next to him was my father. "What's going on?" Not particularly specific, but I couldn't think of anything else to say. "I met with Kodo secretly here in Sendai," said Sanan, "and we've agreed to work together in order to do research on the Furies." "Then you're working with the Imperial Army now?" "Is that what you think?" "Interesting," said Sanan. "Well, perhaps that's true." He gave me a teasing smile. My father looked at me concerned. "How are you feeling, Chizuru? I tried not to hit you too hard." "Oh." It was a sick parody of kindness, but there was something in his tone that reminded me of the father I remembered. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay. He had kidnapped me, true, but he hadn't tied me up or shackled me in some way. That was unexpected. Perhaps—" "I wouldn't suggest attempting to escape," said Sanan. "We could make that difficult." "Okay." So long as Sanan and my father were in the room, then escape was hopeless. "In any event," said Sanan, "it was reckless of you to bring her here, Kodo." Sanan's face was bitter as he looked at my father. "Hichikata is no fool. He may well be on to our plan." My father's brow furrowed. "You were the one who told me that if I wanted to know where my daughter was, all I had to do was follow Todo to the Shinsengumi." "Yes," said Sanan, "I did, but I never suggested we ought to kidnap her." He sighed. "Well, what's done is done," said Sanan. "No point arguing about it. We need to be thinking about what this could mean and plan for it." You needn't worry about the future," said Kodo. His eyes were narrow and his voice confident. "I'm sure the Furies I left to deal with young Todo will return to the castle soon." "What? What did they do to Heisuke?" But I already knew the answer.